As we know, the laws of physics change based on whether you're dealing on the level of where human beings exist. Newtonian physics often can apply. But as you go to subatomic particles, then it's more quantum theory and unpredictability. So the point is that physics, the laws of physics change based on how you're looking at it or where you are, what your frame of reference is. In the book I talk about the three blind men who encounter an elephant. And the one who touches the ear thinks the creature is like a fan. The one who touches the leg thinks the creature is like a tree trunk. And the one who touches the trunk, the nose, thinks it's more like a tube or a snake. And this is another example of how where your perspective is, you're speaking absolute truth, but you're only speaking of partial perspective. So then you have Viktor Frankl, who comes along and he says that it's not about happiness, it's about searching for meaning. Now, in his perspective as someone who survived a concentration camp, that was correct. Those people who pursue happiness in a concentration camp are not going to survive. You can't find happiness there. People who have meaning, who have a meaning to survive, can avoid the calamity to some extent. They can have it be meaningful and suffer, but not suffer. And so I think if you relate Viktor Frankl to Robert Keegan and to our friend Maslow, then it makes sense, right? So as you go up Maslow's hierarchy, where you need food and shelter and other people, you're sort of moving up, and so your meaning increases. Well, at the lower levels, similarly from a developmental stage, earlier in Keegan and earlier in our biological forms as children, meaning isn't so important to us, yet we can have a lot of happiness. But as we move up, yes, meaning suddenly takes on a great value and can propel people forward through times of suffering, move them up Maslow's hierarchy, move them through Keegan's scale. And Keegan talks about how in the later stages, and even Maslow came to this too later in his life, that at a certain point you come to transcendence, where suddenly, if you're working in business, you're like, this doesn't have any meaning anymore. Nothing has any meaning. And people encounter a midlife crisis and they can collapse. But there's an opportunity. It's a sort of a midlife awakening or a new seeing, where you begin to transcend meaning itself, right? So you realize that the world doesn't mean anything, and it doesn't mean anything that it doesn't mean anything. That's sort of the way through that. But what it means on a deeper level is that our minds are meaning-making machines, and if we're constantly trying to make meaning of things, then we'll be stuck in our minds. So at a certain point, you have to say goodbye to Viktor Frankl's formula. If you're no longer in that, as I talked about physics, if you're no longer in that environment, in that Newtonian world, and now you're into the world of subatomic particles, I'm just using it as a metaphor, but if you're in a different situation where you have met all your needs, and you've even achieved something in terms of career or relationship or had a child or whatever criteria you're using, but now you're operating a level where you're realizing that meaning isn't it either. Right? Accomplishment isn't it. The ego isn't it. The mind isn't it. This is where we come to the point where it's time to transcend the mind, to watch the mind do its meaning making. You can't stop that, but to no longer derive your self-worth from that. So Maslow talked about it as transcendence. Keegan talks about that as the final stages, where you're no longer identified with your values, your ideas, your opinions, your occupation, your nationality, all those things which worked really well on the Newtonian level of the world. They helped get you through and got you out of bed in the morning and help you deal with any kind of suffering. But the real way to transcend suffering is to transcend the meaning making. So this is what we're talking about. It's enlightenment. So I think Frankl is great. He does get you to a certain stage, but he can't take you all the way.